Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to AP U.S. History, as today we see how popular sovereignty worked out in Kansas. Where in fact, popular sovereignty did not work out as Stephen Douglas had hoped. Southerners had supported the Kansas-Nebraska Act to the unspoken assumption that Kansas, bordering Missouri, would become a slave state, and Nebraska, to the north of it, a free one. However, many of the immigrants to Kansas were small farmers with no interest in slavery. Indeed, several thousand were abolitionist activists deliberately settled there by the New England Immigrant Aid Society, which was a combination of abolitionist activists and land speculators out to do the right thing, stopping slavery, at a profit. Southern fire eaters felt this was cheating, rushed their own colonists into the territory, mostly from Missouri, making sure they were well armed when they went. These men were known as Border Ruffians as they crossed the border, and later during the Civil War as Bushwhackers. In 1855, the time came to elect members of the territorial legislature, and to ensure a pro-slavery victory, voters who came over the border from Missouri and managed to, through voter fraud, elect a pro-slavery legislature which met in the town of Lecompton, Kansas, and pretty soon composed what's known as the Lecompton Constitution, which would have allowed slavery in a new state of Texas. Abolitionists and free soilers were furious at this government created through voter fraud, and so they too created an illegal government, not holding an official election, but rather choosing a government to meet in Topeka, Kansas. So Kansas now had two illegitimate governments, one created fraudulently, one created illegally. President Pierce, however, to try to keep the South happy, recognized the pro-slavery Lecompton Constitution and ignored the free soil government in Topeka until it became too outspoken to ignore, at which point he denounced them as rebels. A congressional committee visited Kansas to study the issue and determined that while it was not elected properly, the free soil government did truly represent the will of the majority of real Kansans. So both groups, pro and anti-slavery, organized militias to defend themselves and harass their opponents. At religious meetings in New England, the Presbyterian minister and temperance advocate Henry Ward Beecher raised money to buy the latest Sharp's breech-loading rifles, among the best firearms in the world, and shipped them to Kansas. When the anti-slavery militias received these, they called them Beecher's Bibles. And the anti-slavery militias and guerrilla forces that arose in Kansas came to be known as Jayhawkers, a term originally meaning thief or bandit. So, violence broke out in Kansas as people fought over slavery and over the opposing government. They also fought over land claims, which had been poorly regulated and registered since there was no universally recognized government. One farmer might have land registered by the government in Topeka, another farmer the same land registered under the laws of Lecompton. And so, as Border Ruffians and Jayhawkers fought each other, this long and unpleasant period was known as Bleeding Kansas. In 1856, Samuel Jones, a sheriff from a pro-slavery town, visited the town of Lawrence, Kansas, a free soil town, where he was shot in the back because he had previously arrested a free soil man who in turn had threatened a pro-slavery Kansan who had himself killed a free soil man. So a long train of tit for tat. And while the people of Lawrence offered a reward for the discovery of the attacker of Sheriff Jones, who did survive, by the way, and as you can tell by his uniform, go on to fight for the South in the Civil War, pro-slavery forces used the shooting of Sheriff Jones as an excuse to attack the pro-slavery town of Lawrence. And while no one was killed, an anti-slavery printing press was destroyed, many buildings burnt and looted. In response to this attack, the fanatical abolitionist named John Brown led a group of men, including 4 of his many sons, to the pro-slavery settlements along Pottawattomie Creek, where they surprised 5 pro-slavery men and hacked them to pieces with broadswords. Now, it wasn't known for certain who committed this crime till many years later when one of the men involved confessed, but even in 1856 Brown was suspected, arrest warrants were published for him and his sons, and their houses were burnt down. And violence intensified across Kansas following the Pottawattomie Massacre, with 29 more deaths in the 3 months that followed, and violence even spread back east. Now, shortly after the raid on Lawrence, although before the Pottawattomie Creek Massacre, Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts, one of the few really prominent outright abolitionists then in Congress, gave a speech in the Senate entitled "The Crime Against Kansas," in which he attacked pro-slavery men as hirelings picked from the drunken spew and vomit of an uneasy civilization. He particularly went out of his way to insult South Carolina and South Carolina's senior senator, Andrew P. Butler, who 6 years before had read John C. Calhoun's last address to Congress. Sumner called Andrew P. Butler, among other things, a new Don Quixote, off on a misguided quest on behalf of the harlot slavery, compared his support for the Kansas-Nebraska Act to a British officer trying to ram the Stamp Act down the throats of Americans with his sword. This did not go over as well as Sumner may have wished. Butler was dignified. He was well liked by his fellow senators. In fact, he was not even present to defend himself when Sumner made this speech attacking him. And in addition to the disapproval of many senators, Butler had a nephew, Preston Brooks, who was a representative from South Carolina. And Brooks was infuriated by this attack on his state and the insult to the honor of his uncle. Now, a proper Southern gentleman, if his honor is offended or the honor of a close relative is offended, will challenge another gentleman to a duel. But Sumner was not, Brooks felt, a gentleman, and he had lowered himself to the rank of common trash by speaking such filth about a fellow senator. And so a gentleman cannot duel an inferior, but he may physically chastise him. So on May 22nd, 1856, Brooks strode into the Senate chamber where he found Sumner at his desk and beat him to within an inch of his life with his gold-tipped cane. Other senators kept anyone from stopping this beating, it only coming to an end when the cane broke over Sumner's head. Sumner suffered extensive nerve damage, and had to leave the Senate for 3.5 years of specialist treatment in Europe, but Massachusetts re-elected him to the Senate anyway to prove a point. Congress considered expelling Bully Brooks, but did not have the 2/3 majority required to do so. Brooks resigned anyway, but was so popular in the South that not only was he re-elected, he was sent numerous canes to replace the one he had broken over Sumner. And Florida, the town of Brooksville, was named in his honor. You can visit it today, about 40 miles west of Orlando. So it was seen throughout the nation as a sign of how bad times had become, that a cultured man like Sumner could be so vulgar in his speech, that a gentleman like Brooks would respond like a street thug. In many ways, the fighting in Congress and the fighting in Kansas was the start of the war between the states. Indeed, bleeding Kansas would continue to bleed off and on for the next 9 years or more. But by 1857, Kansas had enough inhabitants to apply for statehood. The new president, James Buchanan, Pierce having served only one term, was another Northerner, hoping to appease the South, another doughface. And when Kansas applied for statehood, Buchanan supported the Lecompton Constitution, arguing that this was the will of the people, but many members of Congress opposed it, including Stephen Douglas, who had created the idea of popular sovereignty in Kansas in the first place, feeling this Constitution did not truly represent the popular will of Kansas. And he convinced Congress to hold a referendum in Kansas on the entire Constitution, pro-slavery parts and all, and it was overwhelmingly rejected. And this debate would keep Kansas from joining the Union as a state till 1861. You know, for all the struggle, over the principle of slavery in Kansas, Nebraska. The 1860 census revealed that in all of Kansas there were only 2 slaves. There were 15, though, in Nebraska. As already mentioned, when the Democrats had to nominate a new presidential candidate in 1856, they decided not to renominate Franklin Pierce. Although he was, I'm sure, well-intended, he had not had a successful presidency. His attempts to keep the peace had done nothing of the sort. There's some debate if he even wanted to be renominated, considering the tragedies, both personal and political, of his first term. After losing the nomination, he reportedly said, "There's nothing left to do but get drunk." And he returned to New Hampshire and did just that. The Democrats also avoided Stephen Douglas, who, although a powerful speaker and a well-known figure, probably the most prominent Democrat on the national stage at this point, was now too controversial for his involvement in the debacle of Bleeding Kansas. So the Democrats chose James Buchanan, a wealthy lawyer. Although a Federalist at one point, he had fought in the War of 1812, or at least served in the Maryland militia, and helped defend Baltimore from the British. He'd been a congressman and a senator from Pennsylvania, Secretary of State under Polk, ambassador to England under Pierce. And because he'd been ambassador to England under Pierce, he was overseas during most of the Kansas-Nebraska controversy and not been forced to take a stand on either side. He was a man of several distinguishing physical features. He was 6 feet tall, much above average then, even a bit above today. He had different colored eyes, the left eye green, the right eye blue. And he was nearsighted in his left eye, farsighted in his right eye, and so he typically cocked his head either to one side or to the other, sort of like a chicken, to focus on things near or far away, and he thought that helped him to see better. He also drank heavily, but unlike Pierce, could hold his liquor. Unfortunately, for all his distinguishing physical features, he had few distinguishing political features. He was personally against slavery quite strongly, but he liked Southerners and liked the South and did not want to offend them by acting against slavery politically, and he was another doughface, a Northerner supportive of the South. And the Whigs, the party created to oppose the Democrats, were gone. But a new party had arisen in their place, almost spontaneously in the Midwest and the Northeast, composed of many radical types: free soilers, abolitionists, conscience Whigs, know-nothings, and even unhappy Democrats. And this group were called the Republicans. Again, free soilers, outright abolitionists, conscience Whigs, and know-nothings, the anti-slavery group, even Democrats unhappy with their party's stand on slavery to this point. There being a number of free soil Democrats and some outright abolitionist Democrats. The Republicans officially opposed slavery in the territories. They were not officially an abolitionist party, but they were a free soil party. Though there were fears among Southerners, the Republicans, if given the chance, would ban slavery everywhere. The most prominent Republican was William Henry Seward, who had declared there was a higher law than the Constitution, the law of God, which opposed slavery, whatever protections there might be for slavery in the laws of man. But while he could almost certainly have had the nomination if he wanted it, he didn't think their first time running for the presidency was a good year, and he declined the nomination, which instead went to John C. Fremont, the Pathfinder of the West. Again, the anti-immigrant know-nothings nominated their own candidate, officially running as the American Party candidate, nominating former President Millard Fillmore. The know-nothings demanded that Americans must rule America. Again, when they did not win, those who had not already become Republicans mostly did so later. During the campaign, Buchanan was ridiculed for never having been married, and there were some rumors as to why not. Fremont was accused of being Catholic, which was not true, but the mere accusation was damaging. He was also accused of being half French, which was true, and being an illegitimate born child from Georgia, also true. People doubted his honesty, his ability, and his judgment, which may well have been fair assessments. Furthermore, Southern fire eaters threatened to leave the Union if a Republican, a black Republican, were elected. Black not because, as you can see, he was ethnically black, but Republicans, being seen as pro-black by their opponents, often described the whole party as black Republicans. In 1856, no one won the majority of the popular vote, but Buchanan did win the majority of electoral votes, 174 to 114 to 8 votes for Fillmore from Maryland. And while the Republicans lost, they could claim a noble defeat. They'd put up a good showing against the Democrats, even while running a fairly weak candidate, and even without being on the ballot whatsoever on many southern states. Some historians have suggested it may be just as well Buchanan had won despite his many flaws, because his victory did keep the Union uneasily together until Lincoln could become president. Had Fremont been elected, that might have sparked a civil war, and Fremont, I am pretty sure, would not have been up to the task to stopping it. Now, one thing that made the slavery such a powerful topic, aside from the very unpopular Fugitive Slave Law created by the Compromise of 1850, was the best-selling book of the period, Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, published in 1852 in response to the Fugitive Slave Act. And this book offered a dramatic and emotional account of slave families destroyed by the South's peculiar institution. There were daring escapes, Eliza crossing the ice in the river, heroic sacrifices, including that of Uncle Tom, the cruelty of plantation owners in the South, the monstrous Simon Legree, for example. Now, Harriet Beecher Stowe had never been any deeper into the Deep South than Kentucky, and then only briefly, but she had known runaway slaves on the Underground Railroad. And her book was not meant to be a documentary, but to stir the emotions, and it did. It was a bestseller at home and abroad, especially in Britain, which relied on King Cotton, but which had a strong anti-slavery movement and had outlawed slavery throughout their empire in 1833. Furthermore, Uncle Tom's Cabin introduced Northerners and foreigners who had never seen a Southern plantation to the horror and brutality of slave life in a very sensational manner. Probably exaggerated a bit, but only a bit. And perhaps more than any other issue, this drama, which touched people's emotions, inspired many Northerners to oppose slavery who previously had simply ignored it, not thinking about something so far away. This would play a big role, too, in foreign powers, particularly Britain, choosing not to intervene in the war for Southern independence that came a decade later. And then this uneasy peace and decades of compromises were further shattered in 1857 in what, on the surface, might have been a simple court case. The case of Dred Scott. Dred Scott, as he was known, had been born in Virginia around 1799 as a slave, but in 1830 his master's family had moved to Missouri. When his master died in 1832, Scott was sold to an army surgeon named Emerson, who was frequently posted around the country, including in many free states and territories. When Emerson died, his wife, his widow, began to hire Scott out. In 1846, he sued for his freedom on the grounds he had lived for many years in free states and territories, but the Missouri courts found against him. So Scott eventually, with the help of abolitionists, took this to the Supreme Court, where it would be known as Scott versus Sandford, a misspelling. The actual defendant in the case being John Sandford, brother of the widow Emerson and executor of her husband's estate. Indeed, the widow Emerson said she had already sold Scott to Sandford. Now, the Supreme Court in the Dred Scott case, as it's usually known, The Supreme Court ruled that Scott, as a slave, was not a citizen, and therefore he could not sue in court. And while that might be a little bit morally questionable, legally that probably was airtight and could have ended it there. But the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Roger B. Taney, decided to go further, to prove a point and hopefully settle the question of the expansion or limitation of slavery once and for all. In the majority opinion, which he wrote, blacks, slave or free, were not citizens at all. He said the Founding Fathers could never have imagined a black man being a citizen of the United States. Indeed, he said, and I quote, "The black man has no rights which the white man is bound to respect." Furthermore, even if Scott could have sued, which he couldn't have, but if he could, which he couldn't, he would have lost anyway. Because the Fifth Amendment guarantees the federal government cannot deprive citizens of their property without due process of law. And so, simply living in or traveling to or through a free state could not automatically free someone's slaves, because then the slave owner would have lost his property without a trial. Finally, the court went so far as to rule that Article 6 of the Northwest Ordinance, which had kept slavery out of the Northwest Territory ever since 1787, was unconstitutional, as was the Missouri Compromise, which had already effectively been wiped out by the Compromise of 1850 and the Kansas-Nebraska Act. But just to be clear, it was unconstitutional as well. The Supreme Court declared that Congress had no power to ban slavery anywhere, even in states or new territories that wanted slavery to be illegal there. Southerners were pleased. Popular sovereignty men were irritated because this was one more point of contention between the fire eaters and abolitionists, whom the popular sovereignty men had hoped to appease through compromise. And of course, free soilers and abolitionists were outraged. They claimed the Supreme Court had not issued a decision, only an opinion. Indeed, dismissed the court as merely a Southern debating society. Republicans accused the court of putting sectional politics above legality. Southerners, in turn, were offended by further attacks, as they saw it, against the South, and even attacks against the Constitution of the United States, which guaranteed the rights of the states and the power of the Supreme Court. Now, by now, Dred Scott's owner had married an anti-slavery man, Calvin Chaffee, indeed back in 1850, and they arranged for Scott to be freed shortly after the case ended. Indeed, his owner had really supported his case, hoping that it would be a way to attack slavery as a whole. But so Dred Scott was finally freed and died of tuberculosis, a free man, 18 months later in 1858. And in addition to this episode of national bitterness, all these episodes of national bitterness, the country was also suffering from economic problems. So much gold had been discovered in the California gold rush, it had created inflation. The Crimean War in Europe had, in the mid-1850s, created a worldwide demand for grain. And Westerners had increased their crop production, but when the war ended, the market for grain collapsed. But early in 1857, Congress had had a large surplus in the Treasury. Southerners said, and some others too, said this proved the government did not need to raise as much money as it had been, and Congress passed the Tariff of 1857, lowering the tariff to 20%, the lowest since the War of 1812, but this hurt northern manufacturers a bit, and they resented the tariff and the South, as it did hurt them and offered the prospect of further harm. Furthermore, there was a railroad boom and then a railroad bust, as many people speculated in railroad stock, and many of those railroad companies went under. So falling wheat prices, inflation, bad speculation in railroads, harm to northern manufacturers from the Tariff of 1857, and other problems too, led to a major economic crash the Panic of 1857. The North, hurt some by the tariff and closely tied to the grain-growing West, suffered badly. But the South, ruled by King Cotton, which remained very profitable, did just fine. People starved in northern cities. Industrialists went bankrupt. Republicans blamed the South and the tariff for their problems. And Northerners and Westerners were beginning to make demands of their own, including a demand for free homesteads in the West. The new territories in the Great Plains be given away, at least in part, for free. That a homestead, a quarter section, 160 acres, be given free to anyone who would go and settle on it. Now, this plan was not supported by all Northerners. Northern industrialists worried their workers would move west and search for free land. Southerners certainly opposed it. 160 acres was not enough land for a full-scale plantation, so a scheme seemed tailor-made to deter the western expansion of slavery. Congress did not end up passing a free Homestead Act, but did pass a Homestead Act selling land at only 25 cents an acre, even then a pretty minimal sum, passing that law in 1860, but it was vetoed by President Buchanan. In 1858, there was a race for the Senate in Illinois that captured the nation's attention. The Little Giant, Stephen Douglas, was due for re-election. The Republicans chose Abraham Lincoln to oppose him. Lincoln was tall and scrawny, but tough, reputed to be one of the best, maybe the very best athlete in the state, maybe the whole country. He was skilled at boxing, at wrestling, at the long jump. Indeed, the Wrestling Hall of Fame has inducted him as a member. He was born in a log cabin, mostly self-educated, speaking with a backwoods accent his whole life, and often treated with scorn by people when they first met him, seeing him as a backwoods hick. Although he made his career as a lawyer and supposedly refused to take cases he couldn't work in good conscience, so he came to be known as Honest Abe, he'd also worked in more menial tasks, including rail splitting, splitting logs into long rails for fences, a career for which many people remembered him. People who wanted to call him uncouth and uncultured pointed out he had worked as a rail splitter and worked for an uneducated man, but he was also presented as a rail splitter to those who wanted to appeal to the common man. So it could be used both ways, and it was. Again, perceived as simple, he was actually very intelligent and devious. A former Whig, he had served one term in Congress where he opposed the Mexican War. But after the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, he became a prominent Republican speaker in the Midwest. Now, in 1858, as the Illinois state legislature decided whom to appoint senator, senators not yet being elected by the people of the states, Lincoln challenged Douglas to a series of debates to bring their case to the people in hopes that the people would in turn influence their legislators, or possibly even elect legislators who would take the side of Lincoln or Douglas. Lincoln often did not have very good delivery. His speeches today are remembered as being so good because they were sometimes cleaned up by friendly reporters. But he argued with great logic. The most famous of the debates between Lincoln and Douglas was at Freeport, Illinois, where, following the Dred Scott decision, Lincoln tried to trap Douglas, saying, "What will happen if a territory votes against slavery?" But the Supreme Court, of course, has said they cannot. Would the will of the people, expressed through popular sovereignty as championed by Douglas, prevail? Or would the Supreme Court ruling that the government could not block slavery anywhere force a territory or state to have slavery against the will of its people? Now, Douglas did have an answer for this, which came to be known as the Freeport Doctrine. He said no matter what the Supreme Court said, slavery would stay down if the people wanted it down. If the majority of the people in a territory or state did not want slavery, they just wouldn't buy slaves. Furthermore, they wouldn't make the kind of laws a slave society needed. There would be no slave codes. Fugitive slave laws would not be created or enforced. There were, he said, legal, peaceful ways to keep slavery out of any place that was not welcome. Douglas did win the Senate seat. Popular sovereignty was still popular in the West, and Douglas had many friends in state legislatures. Although some historians have suggested that an accounting of the overall popular vote in Illinois would have favored Lincoln. The way the state legislature was set up and its voting districts, Stephen Douglas's friends did win a majority in the state legislature, but in purely even representation, some historians claim would have put Lincoln ahead. Certainly, many observers felt that Lincoln, by attacking slavery head-on, was far more convincing than the convoluted logic of its latest supporters, and that Lincoln had won a moral victory. Certainly it thrust him onto the national stage at a time when the Republican Party was seeking leadership. Douglas, on the other hand, won no new friends and probably lost some. By continuing to support slavery's right to exist, he disappointed anti-slavery factions. While suggesting ways to limit it, he annoyed the South, and pleasing no one. And then, in October 1859, John Brown appeared in Harper's Ferry, Virginia, now part of West Virginia, with 21 other men, including 3 of his many sons. He had 20 children of his own and had adopted a black child as well. 16 of his followers were white, 5 were black. Their plan, in what's remembered as John Brown's raid, was to seize the federal arsenal in the town, seize the Army's supply of weapons there, and create an army of freed blacks. Initially, they would form a nation of their own in the mountains of western Virginia, from which they would raid the enslaved areas around them, freeing slaves and attracting runaways as they did so. This would develop into a full-scale slave insurrection in the South, ending the peculiar institution forever. Brown and his men seized the arsenal quickly. Indeed, they took control of the whole town for a time, killing 7 civilians in the process, including 1 free black man. They injured 10 more innocent bystanders. But despite Brown's hopes, Southern blacks did not rise to support him. For one thing, communication being what it was, most people had no idea what was going on in the mountains of western Virginia. In any case, slaves were aware that slave uprisings in the U.S. to this point had always ended in failure, and with the brutal deaths of many of their participants. And next day, the Marines arrived, under the leadership of Lieutenant Colonel Robert E. Lee, who was at his home near Washington on leave from his post as Commandant of West Point. Although not a Marine himself, he was a high-ranking officer with experience in the war in Mexico, and led a detachment of Marines to Harper's Ferry. They surrounded the arsenal, offered Brown the chance to surrender, but he refused. The Marines stormed the building. One tried to stab him with his bayonet, but hit Brown the belt buckle, which deflected the blade, so they then beat him unconscious and arrested him. John Brown was put on trial for treason against the Commonwealth of Virginia for trying to lead a revolution within the borders of the state. Some of his friends tried to have him declared insane. Indeed, at least 13 of his close relatives, including his mother, were known to be insane. But Brown would have none of that. He was not crazy. He was doing what God had told him to do. And the governor of Virginia was not sympathetic to any kind of plea that might get him off anyway. They had a legal trial, but one that was very fast. The outcome was no surprise when Brown was sentenced to death. There were some hopes of breaking him out. Indeed, a man who had plans to break him out managed to sneak into the prison and offer to help him escape. But Brown, at the age of 59, felt he could not live a life on the run, and indeed preferred to be a martyr. And he was hanged December 2nd, 1859. Now, there were some opponents of slavery, notably Harriet Tubman, who said he was a hero for what he had done. Others, at least for now, including Frederick Douglass, who had known of Brown's plan in advance and advised him against it, felt that while Brown's motives and dedication were admirable, his actions were illegal and unwise, likely to make trouble between North and South worse. Although Frederick Douglass later praised Brown, said Brown was far more zealous against slavery than he was himself. Frederick Douglass said, "I could live for the slave. John Brown could die for him." William Lloyd Garrison, strongly anti-slavery, published a column in the Liberator saying John Brown's raid was well-intended but sadly misguided. Abraham Lincoln felt John Brown was a lunatic who had done the cause of ending slavery far more harm than good by giving a bad name through his violence. So at the time, a large number of Americans agreed with his execution. Whatever his goals, leading a rebellion and provoking the South were not the best ways to achieve them. But as time passed, more and more Northerners came to feel his execution had been barely better than murder. John Brown did, as he had wanted, come to be seen as a martyr, and years to come, his soul would go marching on.